The myth of the American working class has always been wrapped around the muscular riffs of an electric guitar and the romantic ideal of a highway that never ends. For a generation of listeners, Bruce Springsteen was not merely a rock star. He was the primary architect of a secular gospel that celebrated endurance, loyalty, and the rugged dignity of everyday people. His songs were cinematic blueprints of escape, painting vivid pictures of restless souls searching for a redemptive truth just beyond the neon lights of decaying factory towns. Audiences looked at the man on stage, sweating, straining, and pouring his heart out over 4-hour sets, and believed they were witnessing the absolute pinnacle of emotional transparency. There was an unspoken covenant between the performer and the crowd, a collective agreement that the honesty bleeding through the speakers was mirrored exactly in the life of the man who wrote them. Yet, behind the triumphant stadium chants and the carefully cultivated image of the blue-collar savior, a profoundly different reality was quietly festering in the dark. The very anthems that promised deliverance to millions were masking a deep, paralyzing terror of vulnerability that haunted the singer long after the stage lights faded and the crowds went home. To understand the profound disconnect that eventually shattered his private life, one must examine the dizzying velocity with which fame transformed Bruce Springsteen from a localized folk hero into a global commodity. By the early 1980s, the crushing weight of the born in the USA phenomenon had pushed his celebrity into a stratosphere that few human beings are ever equipped to navigate. The world demanded that he be a prophet of resilience, an unchanging pillar of strength for a disillusioned nation, but internally, the musician was grappling with a fractured sense of self. Fame, by its very nature, offers an intoxicating illusion of intimacy while simultaneously constructing an impenetrable wall against real connection. On the road, Springsteen could bask in the unconditional adoration of 80,000 screaming voices, a manufactured ecstasy that required no emotional reciprocity, no compromise, and absolutely no accountability. It was an environment where a person could easily mistake the applause of strangers for genuine emotional security, allowing internal anxieties to remain unexamined. Away from the microphone, however, the silence was deafening, and the coping mechanisms that served him so brilliantly on stage began to manifest as a reckless, impulsive detachment in his personal encounters. This psychological tightrope became increasingly unstable when Julian Phillips entered his orbit, presenting a stark and dazzling contrast to the gritty, chaotic world of rock and roll. Julian was a rising Hollywood actress, poised, elegant, and grounded in a traditional lifestyle that seemed entirely removed from the exhausting machinery of stadium tour. To the public, their whirlwind courtship looked like the ultimate contemporary fairy tale, a glamorous collision of Hollywood sophistication and authentic rock grit that captured the imagination of the media. For Springsteen, the relationship represented something far more urgent than a romance. It felt like a desperately needed anchor, a tangible chance to claim a normal life before the madness of his career consumed him entirely. He convinced himself that marrying this beautiful, stable woman would automatically cure the chronic restlessness that had plagued him since childhood, effectively fixing his internal machinery by sheer force of will. They moved toward the altar with a frantic momentum, driven by a mutual infatuation and the heavy expectations of an audience eager to see their hero achieve a happily ever after. It was a decision made in a state of emotional vertigo, where the desire for stability completely decoupled from a realistic assessment of readiness. The illusion of safety shattered almost the exact moment the wedding vows were finalized, replaced by a sudden, suffocating panic that caught the singer completely off guard. Instead of the profound peace he had anticipated, the reality of legal and emotional commitment triggered a deep-seated claustrophobia that unleashed a wave of severe, destabilizing anxiety attacks. The man who could effortlessly command the attention of entire stadiums found himself paralyzed in the quiet corners of his own home, terrified by the realization that he was now expected to be truly seen by another human being. Intimacy demands a level of self-exposure that cannot be managed by a set list or masked by a theatrical performance, and this realization filled Springsteen with an overwhelming urge to run. Rather than communicating these terrifying internal shifts to his new bride, he instinctively retreated into a fortress of absolute silence, falsely believing that hiding his panic was a form of chivalrous protection. This emotional withholding was the first fatal fissure in the foundation of the marriage, a choice to internalize a growing terror rather than risk the vulnerability of a raw, honest confession. As the months rolled on, that protective silence inevitably curdled into a subtle, toxic form of emotional cruelty that began to systematically erode the couple's daily existence. When a person is incapable of confronting their own internal demons, they almost always begin to project that unexpressed hostility onto the people closest to them, transforming loved ones into adversaries. Springsteen found himself weaponizing his own insecurities against Julian, inventing narrative justifications for the emotional distance he was creating between them. Sitting across from her at the dinner table, he would silently rehearse elaborate scripts of resentment, deliberately questioning her motives, doubting her affection, and imagining betrayals that existed nowhere outside his own mind. He began to view her not as a partner, but as a golden cage designed to restrict his freedom, transforming his own inability to commit into a grievance against her character. It was a tragic, invisible sabotage, executed by a man who was deeply accustomed to writing tragic stories about broken homes, now unconsciously authoring his own. The public, completely blinded by the glittering exterior of the superstar couple, had absolutely no inkling of the profound emotional rot that was hollowed out beneath the surface. To the outside world, Springsteen was still the undefeated champion of the American dream, a man who had conquered the music industry and won the heart of a beautiful actress without losing his soul. This massive gulf between public perception and private misery only intensified the singer's isolation, making it feel entirely impossible to seek help without destroying the mythos he had spent his life building. He felt trapped by his own legend, forced to perform happiness for the cameras while harboring a dark, destructive secret that grew heavier with every passing day. The tragedy of the situation lay in the fact that the collapse did not originate from an external crisis, an explosive argument, or the sudden intrusion of a rival affection. It was a slow, quiet, and deliberate dismantling of a relationship from the inside out, perpetrated by a man who simply did not possess the psychological tools required to stay. This agonizing period of internal conflict eventually forced its way into his creative output, fundamentally altering the thematic DNA of his songwriting in ways that puzzled and alarmed his most perceptive fans. The booming, triumphant orchestrations that defined his previous work began to fall away, replaced by a sparse, haunting acoustic minimalism that felt distinctly uncomfortable and exposed. When he entered the studio to record the material that would eventually become the Tunnel of Love album, he was no longer writing about the thrill of racing down the highway. He was writing about the terrifying ghosts that inhabit the passenger seat. The new songs were populated by characters who were deeply suspicious of their own happiness, individuals who looked into the eyes of their lovers and saw only a mirror of their own profound inadequacy. It was an extraordinary act of unconscious confession, a musical distress signal broadcast to a global audience, while the man singing the words remained completely incapable of speaking them to his wife. The studio became a laboratory of grief, a controlled environment where Springsteen could safely explore the devastating dimensions of the failure he was actively living out in his private life. What the world initially perceived as a brilliant, experimental shift in artistic direction was, in reality, a desperate psychological survival mechanism operating in real time. He was using the recording process to process a level of confusion and self-loathing that he could not voice during the agonizingly polite dinners and strained conversations that now defined his domestic life. The music was heavy with the palpable fatigue of a man who had run out of roads to travel, a driver who had finally realized that changing his location could never fix the broken engine within. Every line recorded during this dark era was drenched in a profound sense of second-guessing and emotional exhaustion, documenting a spirit that was utterly spent from fighting its own shadow. At home, the atmospheric shift was impossible to ignore, and Julian found herself marooned in a quiet wilderness of growing alienation that defied any conventional attempt at resolution. She was married to a man who was physically present in the room, but emotionally sealed behind a thick, impenetrable wall of creative obsession and internal exile. Springsteen used his work not just as an outlet, but as an effective shield, retreating into the endless details of production and arrangements to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of a quiet evening with his wife. He simply did not know how to find the vocabulary for his distress, and in the absence of clear communication, a heavy, suffocating frustration rushed in to fill the expanding void. Their interactions slowly devolved into circular, exhausting arguments that led nowhere, brief flashes of anger that acted as a poor substitute for the intimacy they were both desperately missing. Each fleeting attempt to bridge the gap between them only seemed to accelerate their mutual despair, creating an agonizing cycle of temporary hope followed by immediate regression. They would experience a rare, fragile moment of closeness, a brief echo of the romance they had imagined, only for Springsteen's deeply rooted defense mechanisms to violently reassert themselves. The fear of being known, of having his flaws fully exposed to someone who genuinely cared for him, would cause him to pull away with an even greater, colder intensity than before. This constant emotional whiplash left both partners feeling profoundly depleted, turning their shared home into a monument of unspoken tension and mutual disappointment. It was a state of perpetual emotional stalemate, a miserable holding pattern where the fear of leaving was matched only by the absolute impossibility of staying. The songs he was writing during this domestic crisis became a meticulous, devastating map of this exact paralysis, capturing the precise texture of a love that is dying from a lack of courage. He wrote with terrifying clarity about couples standing mere inches apart while existing in entirely different universes, about apologies that were delivered with sincerity, but changed absolutely nothing about the underlying dynamic. He documented the excruciating repetition of relationships trapped in a loop of mutual injury, where every conversation felt like a rehearsal of past grievances rather than a path toward a shared future. Although he never explicitly stated to the media that these agonizing vignettes were drawn directly from his own living room, the uncanny timing of the music provided a devastating confirmation. The listeners could feel the raw, unfiltered weight of a man watching his own life drift entirely beyond his control, recording his own descent with the detached precision of a forensic scientist. What rendered this specific period so uniquely agonizing for the rock star was his own acute, unavoidable awareness of his complicity in the unfolding disaster. He could no longer hide behind the convenient excuse of youth, ignorance, or the overwhelming distractions of his monumental fame. He was fully conscious of his own deliberate emotional withdrawal. He watched himself pull away from a good woman, saw the pain reflecting in her eyes, and yet found himself entirely powerless to halt the destructive momentum of his own psychological conditioning. This realization bred a deep, toxic layer of self-loathing that further complicated his ability to act with any degree of decisiveness or honor. Instead of walking into the burning building of his marriage and attempting to either put out the fire or cleanly exit, he chose to postpone the inevitable, falsely believing that a slow fade would somehow reduce the ultimate trauma. But silence is never a preservative for a human relationship. It functions exclusively as a slow, invisible acid that eats away at the core until nothing remains but empty space. By the time Springsteen finalized his preparations to take his new, starkly honest songs out on a massive world tour, the distance between husband and wife was no longer a private theory. It had become a physical reality, an undeniable rift that was already actively shaping the next tumultuous chapter of his life, whether he was consciously prepared for the fallout or not. The upcoming tour was ostensibly designed to promote an album, but in reality, it was structured as an escape hatch, a familiar mechanism to leave the wreckage of his domestic life behind and seek the validation of the road. He was stepping back into the public eye carrying a suitcase full of volatile, unresolved emotions, setting the stage for a spectacular collision between his constructed myth and his unraveling reality. The tragedy of the first marriage was rooted in a profound mismatch between a man's artistic maturity and his emotional development, a gap that success had artificially widened for years. On vinyl, Springsteen could articulate the most complex, heartbreaking truths about the human condition with an eloquence that moved millions to tears. In life, he was still a frightened child of a broken home, terrified that closeness would inevitably lead to abandonment or destruction, repeating the very patterns he had witnessed in his youth. This duality created a deeply unstable existence, where the public hero was constantly at war with the private saboteur, leaving a trail of emotional collateral damage in his wake. As he prepared to step onto the global stage once more, the tension between who he was supposed to be and who he actually was had reached a dangerous, unsustainable breaking point. The impending collapse was further accelerated by the rigid expectations of his fan base, who had invested their own emotional lives into the idea of Springsteen as an infallible moral compass. They did not want to believe that their working-class hero was capable of the same messy, cowardly failures that defined ordinary human relationships. They required him to be better than them. This immense pressure created an environment where honesty outside of music felt like an act of career suicide, encouraging a dangerous culture of secrecy and avoidance within his inner circle. The machinery of rock stardom was entirely complicit in maintaining the illusion, shielding the artist from the consequences of his behavior while enabling the continuation of a lifestyle that deferred adulthood indefinitely. It was a beautifully gilded trap of his own making, one that rewarded his artistic confessions while actively insulating him from the hard work of personal transformation. When the history of this period is evaluated, it becomes clear that the impending introduction of a new relationship was not the cause of the Marshall breakdown, but rather the catalyst that exposed an existing ruin. The architecture of his union with Julian Phillips had been compromised from the very beginning by the structural flaws of panic, haste, and a profound lack of emotional transparency. The marriage did not fail because the rock and roll lifestyle was inherently incompatible with domestic bliss. It failed because one of the participants was using the relationship as a shield against himself. You cannot build a sanctuary with a partner when you are constantly looking for the nearest exit sign, and you cannot offer love when you are convinced that being known will lead to your destruction. The stage was set for a public reckoning, a moment where the curtain would be forcibly pulled back, revealing the flawed, frightened man behind the roaring engine of the E Street Band. As the Tunnel of Love Express tour kicked off, the atmosphere backstage was thick with an unexpressed dread, a collective awareness among the crew and musicians that they were traveling with a live wire. The songs themselves were a nightly confrontation with discomfort, forcing the singer to inhabit his own regrets under the glare of stadium spotlights in front of thousands of onlookers. It was an incredibly bizarre form of public therapy, where the patient was applauded for his symptoms while the actual disease remained entirely untreated in the dressing rooms. Every performance was a high-stakes tightrope walk, a desperate attempt to maintain artistic control over a personal life that was rapidly spinning out of orbit. The music had stopped being a reflection of his life. It had become an active participant in its dismantling, pushing him toward an edge he could no longer avoid. The tragedy was that Julian remained largely isolated from this world, left behind in a quiet domestic space, while her husband's psychological drama was exported to arenas across the globe. She was forced to watch from a distance, as the man who had promised her stability transformed back into the elusive, restless wanderer he had always been. The dignity with which she navigated this increasing estrangement is a testament to a strength that the public narrative often overlooked in favor of the rock star's internal angst. She was not a character in a Springsteen song. She was a real human being experiencing the profound pain of being systematically erased from the life of the person she loved. The slow-motion car crash of their marriage was moving toward its final, inevitable impact, driven by a momentum that had been building long before they ever walked down the aisle. In the final analysis of this first phase, the true failure was not the absence of love, but the absolute lack of courage required to honor that love with truth. Springsteen had all the passion in the world, an infinite supply of romantic intensity that could fill records and ignite stadiums. But passion without vulnerability is ultimately a hollow exercise. He had chosen the safety of a beautiful illusion over the terrifying labor of a real relationship, and the bill for that choice was finally coming due. The man who had spent his youth running away from the suffocating realities of his hometown was discovering that the most dangerous cage is the one you carry inside your own chest. There was no highway long enough to outrun the truth of what he had done to his marriage, and the road ahead was about to become incredibly steep. As part one of this documentary analysis concludes, we see a superstar at the absolute zenith of his commercial power, completely adored by the world, yet utterly bankrupt in the privacy of his own heart. The stage was set for a transition that would forever alter his legacy, a moment where the private whispers would transform into a public roar that no level of fame could drown out. The line between fiction and reality had blurred to the point of erasure, and the singer was about to discover exactly what happens when the songs you write begin to demand your actual life as payment. The next chapter would not be a story of quiet erosion, but of an explosive, public collision that would leave no one unscarred. Part 2. The introduction of Patti Scialfa into the immediate epicenter of Bruce Springsteen's emotional crisis was not the arrival of a stranger, but the sudden, intense magnification of a long-standing subterranean connection. Patti had been a familiar, comforting presence in the Jersey Shore music scene for years, a talented vocalist who shared the exact same cultural geography, artistic vocabulary, and working-class reference points as the leader of the E Street Band. When she officially stepped onto the stage as a member of the band during the massive Born in the USA tour, she brought an undeniable, earthy authenticity that grounded the grand theatricality of the show. For a long time, their relationship remained strictly contained within the highly structured boundaries of professional collaboration and a deep, protective mutual friendship. She was someone who understood the unique, exhausting pressures of his world without requiring an explanation, an artistic peer who could speak his language fluently without ever demanding that he modify his behavior. However, the entire chemistry of that connection underwent a radical, permanent shift when Springsteen returned to the grueling environment of the road while carrying the suffocating weight of his dying marriage. The touring lifestyle, which had historically served as his ultimate psychological sanctuary, a place where the chaotic confusion of real life could be completely replaced by the comforting rigidity of schedules and set lists, suddenly transformed into a terrifying mirror. Night after night, as they stood shoulder to shoulder under the intense glare of the stadium spotlights, Patti began to represent everything that was tragically missing from his silent, strained home life. There was an effortless emotional alignment between them that required absolutely no performance, an intuitive understanding that bypassed the painful, circular arguments that were currently waiting for him back in Los Angeles. She didn't ask him to explain his paralyzing silences. She didn't demand that he be anyone other than exactly who he was in that moment. And to a man who felt utterly trapped by his own life, that lack of pressure felt like oxygen. During the European leg of the Tunnel of Love tour, their on-stage dynamic evolved from a carefully rehearsed musical collaboration into an unmistakably charged, living theater of mutual attraction that was impossible to ignore. It was no longer a scripted performance designed to entertain a stadium. It was a real, volatile truth breaking through the carefully constructed cracks of the show's narrative. Audiences across the globe began to notice the prolonged, intensely private glances exchanged during duets, the unscripted physical closeness, and a raw, playful intimacy that felt far too authentic to be part of the act. The music they were performing, songs explicitly written about the terrifying deceit and emotional landmines of marriage, was being sung by two people who were actively living out those exact complications in real time. The stage had ceased to be a shield against reality. It had become the very location where his private transgression was being publicly broadcast to millions of onlookers. The international press corps, always hungry for a sensational crack in the pristine armor of America's rock and roll saint, quickly noticed the unmistakable shifts in body language and began documenting the tour with an aggressive, microscopic scrutiny. Photographers followed the band from city to city, staking out hotels and backstage exits, capturing candid moments of casual, domestic intimacy between Bruce and Patty that were completely impossible to dismiss as mere professional camaraderie. What had started as a series of quiet, nervous whispers among the inner circle of the E Street Band quickly hardened into a loud, undeniable global media narrative. The image of the wholesome, happily married rock star was collapsing in real time on the front pages of international tabloids, replaced by a scandalous story of betrayal and rock and roll cliches. Behind the closed doors of his dressing room, Springsteen was experiencing a profound internal unraveling, caught between the terrifying reality of his actions and his deep-seated instinct to hide from confrontation. He would later admit with immense regret that this specific period was the moment he allowed himself to see Patty through a completely different lens, transforming her from a safe, reliable constant into a radical alternative future. The realization did not arrive with any degree of clarity, heroism, or romantic triumph. It arrived deeply tangled in a thick, suffocating web of intense guilt, paralyzing fear, and deliberate avoidance. Instead of doing the hard, painful work of ending his first marriage decisively, and with a shred of human dignity, he made the cowardly choice to try and manage both competing realities simultaneously. He desperately convinced himself that maintaining a strict policy of public discretion would somehow soften the inevitable fallout and protect everyone involved from maximum pain. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, born of a profound emotional immaturity, an attempt to use secrecy as a substitute for actual courage, which ultimately guaranteed that the eventual explosion would be infinitely more destructive. By choosing the perceived safety of privacy over the difficult path of absolute honesty, Springsteen inadvertently created a massive narrative vacuum where wild speculation, toxic rumor, and tabloid cruelty could effortlessly thrive. When he and Julian quietly made the decision to separate behind closed doors, the complete absence of a clear, dignified public explanation made the surrounding story exponentially louder, harsher, and more invasive. Every single gesture, glance, and shared microphone between Bruce and Patty on stage was meticulously dissected by millions of fans and journalists looking for definitive evidence of an illicit affair. The very strategy he believed would protect his estranged wife and his musical legacy ended up deepening the emotional damage, turning a private marital failure into a sordid, highly public spectacle. Years later, looking back at this chaotic wreckage with the painful benefit of sobriety and intensive therapy, he would openly acknowledge that his handling of the situation was deeply, fundamentally flawed. The underlying truth, as he would eventually find the courage to admit, was not that a grand, unstoppable love had unexpectedly appeared to rescue him from a bad situation. It was that he had utterly failed to confront his responsibilities with courage. The moral line had been crossed in his heart long before any physical boundaries were breached or any definitive words were spoken out loud. And once that boundary was violated, there was no quiet, dignified way back. He had allowed his fear of an uncomfortable conversation to dictate his actions, resulting in a scenario where the people he cared about were left to be slaughtered in the court of public opinion. The man who had built an entire career on the concept of standing tall and facing the hard truths of life had completely folded when faced with the necessity of an honest, adult break. As the summer of that turbulent year reached its peak, the separation between the rock star and the actress ceased to be a private arrangement known only to an intensely loyal inner circle. They were no longer functioning as a married couple in any sense of the word, yet the machinery surrounding the singer continued to maintain a defensive, stonewalling silence that only heightened the public's morbid curiosity. There was no coordinated press release, no carefully worded joint statement designed to mitigate the media frenzy, and absolutely no attempt to frame the narrative in a humanizing way. Springsteen foolishly clung to the belief that if he simply refused to engage with the press, the story would eventually lose its momentum and fade away into the background. In reality, his stubborn silence functioned as an invitation for the tabloids to invent their own highly sensationalized, villainous versions of the story, filling the void with maximum drama. On the road, the undeniable emotional current between Bruce and Patty continued to play out night after night under the blazing stadium lights of European football arenas, providing a daily source of fuel for the media fire. What the ecstatic, screaming fans experienced as raw, transcendent musical chemistry, the traveling press corps treated as a daily, undeniable confirmation of an ongoing scandal. Paparazzi photographs regularly surfaced from various European tour stops, showing the couple sharing quiet moments on hotel balconies, walking through cities hand in hand, and exhibiting a level of comfort that directly contradicted his public status as a married man. The narrative practically wrote itself, presenting a simplistic, highly damaging story of a ruthless rock star abandoning his innocent, naive young wife for the sake of a scandalous tour bus romance. When Springsteen's longtime publicist finally issued a terse, unadorned confirmation that he and Julian had officially separated, the disastrous timing of the announcement only served to validate the worst public suspicions. To the casual observer and the dedicated fan base alike, it appeared as though the marriage had ended solely because of the blatant, shameless infidelity that was currently unfolding on stage every single night. Bruce knew that the internal reality was infinitely more complex, that the foundations of the marriage had been completely hollowed out by his own psychological panic long before Patty ever became a factor. But by choosing to manage the end of his relationship through a strategy of avoidance and strategic silence, he had surrendered his right to tell the truth, allowing the media to define his character for him. The internal psychological fallout of this public disaster was utterly devastating for everyone caught within its expanding blast radius. Julian Phillips, demonstrating an extraordinary, resilient dignity that stood in sharp, silent contrast to her husband's chaotic public life, withdrew entirely from the Hollywood spotlight and refused to engage in the media circus. She steadfastly declined to offer any interviews, write any retaliatory tell-all articles, or participate in any narrative that would transform her genuine personal agony into a consumable public commodity. Her closest friends were strictly instructed never to discuss the details of the split with journalists, creating a protective wall of absolute silence around her recovery process. What little she eventually communicated in the subsequent decades made one thing completely undeniable. Her refusal to speak was not an act of denial, but a fierce, necessary strategy of emotional self-preservation. For Springsteen, the compounding weight of guilt became an almost intolerable burden that cast a dark, suffocating shadow over the immense commercial success of the tour. He was forced to look into the mirror every morning and recognize that his own cowardice, his habit of postponing honesty, and his desperate avoidance of confrontation had directly inflicted massive public humiliation on someone who had trusted him. He had genuinely believed he was minimizing harm by dragging his feet, but instead, he had extended the suffering of both women, turning a private tragedy into an endless, agonizing public trial. The grueling tour continued its relentless march across the globe. The iconic songs were performed with their usual explosive energy, and the massive crowds continued to cheer their approval every night. Yet, beneath the deafening roar of the applause, the singer carried the sickening awareness that the most profound personal failure of his life was being consumed as entertainment by millions of people. There was absolutely no clean, heroic ending to be found in the wreckage of his first marriage, no dignified transition that could preserve the carefully constructed myth of the infallible working-class saint. There was only a messy, deeply embarrassing exercise in damage control, a profound sense of lingering regret, and the slow, agonizing realization that immense fame offers absolutely no insulation from the consequences of human behavior. If anything, the unprecedented scale of his celebrity functioned as a massive magnifying glass, enlarging every flaw, every mistake, and every act of cowardice until they were visible to the entire world. By the time the legal divorce documents were finally signed and finalized, the sordid tabloid version of the story had already permanently hardened into rock history legend. To a vast segment of his global fan base, the narrative was incredibly simple. The marriage had tragically ended because a wealthy, powerful man had engaged in a cliché, self-indulgent affair while out on the road. To Springsteen himself, the marriage had collapsed because he was a profoundly damaged individual who did not yet possess the courage or the self-awareness required to look honestly into his own soul. The massive, irreconcilable gulf between those two drastically different versions of the truth would continue to haunt his mind and infect his creative output for decades to come. He had escaped his marriage. He had found a new partner, but he had done so at a moral cost that would require a lifetime of intensive psychological labor to fully understand and eventually redeem. The true tragedy of this second phase was the realization that the road, which had always been his ultimate weapon against depression and anxiety, had finally turned against him, exposing his secrets instead of burying them. He could no longer run to the stage to escape the consequences of his actions, because the stage had become the very place where those consequences were being calculated in real time. The E Street Band itself, a tight-knit musical family built on decades of mutual trust and shared sacrifice, was forced to navigate the profound discomfort of watching their leader unravel in front of them. The music had lost its ability to provide easy answers, leaving the singer stranded in a hostile landscape of his own making, where every cheer from the audience felt increasingly like an unearned accolade for a man who had lost his way. As this second segment draws to close, we witness a man who has successfully demolished his old life, but has not yet figured out how to build a legitimate, honest foundation for his new one. He is surrounded by the ruins of a public scandal, carrying a mountain of unexpressed guilt, and realizing that the myth of the restless rambler is a profoundly lonely identity to maintain when the music stops playing. The line had been crossed, the damage had been thoroughly executed, and the long, slow, and incredibly painful process of public confession and personal accountability was about to begin. The singer who had spent his entire life telling stories about other people's struggles was finally being forced by reality to tell the absolute, unvarnished truth about himself. Part 3. The profound public silence that Bruce Springsteen maintained in the immediate, painful aftermath of his divorce was not a sign of indifference. It was the outward manifestation of an intense, decades-long internal reckoning. For a generation after the collapse of his first marriage, interviews with the rock star would routinely circle around the edges of his private life, only to be deftly deflected, softened, or reframed as abstract artistic reflections on the nature of love. To the casual observer, this persistent refusal to engage with the past looked exactly like classic celebrity avoidance, a calculated attempt to let a damaging scandal fade from the public consciousness. In reality, it was the behavior of a man who knew that his internal ledger was still deeply unbalanced, an individual who understood that a premature public explanation would only serve as cheap self-justification. He recognized with absolute clarity that the truth, once spoken plainly and without the protective mask of musical metaphor, would not offer him a quick path to redemption, but would instead permanently codify his deepest human failures. That long-deferred moment of absolute personal accountability finally arrived when Springsteen sat down to write his sweeping, unsparing autobiography, a project that required him to confront his ghosts without the benefit of a backing band. For the first time in his legendary career, the musician allowed himself to describe the agonizing demise of his union with Julian Phillips without hiding behind the cinematic imagery of his lyrics or the booming energy of his rock persona. He did not attempt to cast himself as a tragic victim of overwhelming circumstance, an artist consumed by the unique, distorting pressures of monumental global fame, or a man swept away by an unavoidable destiny. Instead, he chose to dissect his own behavior with an uncomfortable, almost clinical precision, refusing to grant himself any semantic escape hatches or comforting excuses. He admitted with a raw, bracing honesty that he had handled the entire separation badly. Not clumsily, not imperfectly, but fundamentally, undeniably badly, deliberately choosing a word that offered absolutely no room for self-defense. He painted a devastating portrait of a younger self who had already emotionally abandoned the marriage long before he ever managed to find the basic human courage required to say the words out loud to his wife. He described a frightened man who had desperately convinced himself that maintaining a wall of silence would somehow reduce the emotional trauma of the split, when in truth, it was merely a strategy to delay his own personal accountability. He laid bare the uncomfortable truth that fear, rather than passion or artistic romance, had been the primary driving force behind almost every disastrous decision he made during that chaotic era. It was the fear of an uncomfortable confrontation, the terror of being exposed as a flawed and deeply insecure individual, and the absolute panic of admitting that the traditional life he had built no longer fit the person he was actually becoming. Furthermore, Springsteen used his memoir to openly acknowledge a reality he had fiercely resisted confirming to the media for decades, that his deep, life-changing connection with Patty Sylfa did not begin as an accidental, unforeseen collision out on the road. He confessed that their mutual attraction had emerged gradually, built on a foundation of years of proximity, shared creative labor, and a profound emotional alignment that existed long before they ever crossed a physical line. He admitted that he had recognized this profound internal shift well before he chose to act upon it, and that recognition alone should have given him the moral clarity to end his marriage with honesty and respect. Instead, he chose to play a double game, attempting to manage outward appearances and protect his pristine public image, while his actual domestic reality was collapsing in absolute misery behind the scenes. What allowed this late-stage confession to resonate so deeply with audiences was its total, refreshing lack of romantic justification or self-serving philosophical validation. Springsteen did not claim that the eventual longevity of his second marriage somehow excused the toxic, dishonest methods he used to escape his first commitment. He did not frame the painful ending of his relationship with Julian as a necessary, poetic sacrifice on the altar of true love or artistic destiny. He framed it strictly as a profound personal failure. It was a failure to act with decisiveness, a failure to protect a good person who had placed her complete trust in him, and a tragic failure to realize that withholding the truth from a partner is fundamentally just as damaging as telling a direct lie. By the time these unvarnished admissions finally reached the hands of the global public, the tangible consequences of his actions had long since passed into history. The first marriage was a distant memory. The scandalous headlines had faded into obscurity. Julian had built a quiet life entirely away from the media, and what remained was simply the heavy, permanent knowledge of an old mistake that could never be undone. When Springsteen eventually married Patty Sylfa, the union was not packaged to the world as a triumphant, fairy tale ending where true love successfully conquered all obstacles and cleared the ledger. The early years of their marriage were heavily burdened by the unresolved emotional baggage of the past, intense public judgment, and a history that stubbornly refused to remain neatly buried in the archives of rock journalism. They did not step into a clean slate or a private sanctuary. They walked directly into a storm of continued media scrutiny, lingering fan resentment, and a persistent undercurrent of suspicion. Almost immediately, fresh waves of rumors and anonymous allegations would occasionally surface in the press, suggesting that the rock star was still struggling with the same old patterns of restlessness and emotional infidelity. Each time a new headline appeared, threatening to reduce their relationship to a cliché tabloid narrative, the couple chose to respond with a deliberate, united front of absolute public silence. However, what fundamentally separated this second marriage from his disastrous first attempt at domestic life was not a magical achievement of perfection, but a radical new commitment to psychological confrontation. Springsteen had finally begun the agonizing, necessary labor of intensive psychoanalysis, entering a phase of his life where he started speaking openly about his generational inheritance of crippling depression, emotional panic, and self-destructive behavior. Patty did not function as a passive enabler or a shield against these dark internal forces. She was an active participant who absolutely insisted that he stand his ground and face his demons directly. He would later credit her with saving his life, acknowledging that her fierce refusal to accept his habitual emotional distance forced him to grow as a human being in ways that global success and stadium applause never could. Despite the persistent background noise of gossip and the lingering shadow of his public past, Patty remained a steady, uncompromising anchor who refused to let outside narratives dictate the internal reality of their home. She possessed a deep, experiential understanding of how easily false stories and malicious rumors attach themselves to famous men, having lived through the toxic machinery of the music industry alongside him for years. She did not engage in dramatic public denials, angry media counterattacks, or defensive press campaigns designed to rehabilitate their public image. Instead, she chose to hold a fierce, uncompromising line within the private boundaries of their family life, prioritizing the emotional safety of their children and insisting that their daily, lived reality was infinitely more important than the noisy speculations of strangers. Springsteen would frequently describe those intense years of early fatherhood and domestic stability as both the hardest and most profoundly necessary chapters of his entire existence. The mundane, exhausting responsibilities of parenthood did what rock stardom never could. It grounded his restless spirit, forcing him to replace a lifetime of chaotic impulse with the steady, repetitive labor of showing up for other people. The man who had spent his youth writing mythic anthems about running away down the highway finally learned the incredibly difficult art of staying still, discovering that true freedom is found in commitment rather than escape. Yet, the singer never allowed himself to believe that his current happiness gave him a right to forget the wreckage he had left behind on his way to maturity. He carried the permanent memory of his first marriage, the public humiliation of the affair, and the deeply flawed manner in which he handled the transition as a vital, sobering reminder of the destructive capacities hidden within his own psyche. Ultimately, the complex saga of Bruce Springsteen's personal life forces us to look beyond the simplistic, romantic myths of rock and roll and confront the messy, often contradictory reality of human growth. When he finally chose to lay bare his failures in the pages of his memoir, it was not a grand act of heroism designed to win back the uncritical admiration of his audience, but a necessary act of psychological survival. It was the confession of a man who realized that you cannot truly heal a wound until you stop lying about how you received it, even if that admission requires you to tarnish your own legendary reputation. His story remains a powerful, cautionary monument to the fact that immense fame, artistic genius, and global adoration are utterly useless weapons when it comes to fighting the wars within our own hearts. So, when we look back at the moment Bruce Springsteen finally admitted his definitive role in the destruction of his first marriage, we are left with a profound, lingering question about the true nature of accountability. Was his late-stage public confession a genuine act of moral courage, or was it simply a case of an undeniable truth arriving far too late to offer any real justice to the person who was actually harmed? Can a beautifully written public admission ever truly balance the ledger of a private, intimately inflicted pain? Or do some wounds remain permanently open regardless of how eloquently they are archived in a memoir? It is a complex human dilemma that defies any easy, comfortable resolution, reminding us that even our greatest heroes are often just flawed men trying to find their way home in the dark. We invite you to share your own analytical thoughts on this complicated legacy in the comments section below. And if you found this deep dive documentary analysis meaningful, please ensure you like, subscribe, and remain with us as we continue to explore the unfiltered, real stories behind the greatest icons of our cultural history.